Hello, well, thank you very much for staying with the debate, which will continue, and which I'm glad to say I think has been very agreeably unlike a public relations discussion. We've had some proper differences. And I think we might have some more, because I've already looked at some of these comments, which we'll get to in a minute. Just to sort of begin, I want to, and in a sense slightly to recap, I live in East Anglia, and when I turn on the news, I get the news that everyone sees, and then I get this ghastly moment which has this terrible phrase in it which I completely hate, when the presenter turns around and says, "And now for the news where you are." And you then get this kind of retinue of heroically presented, chronically underfunded stuff about trivia. In East Anglia, we had a very good one recently where there was a story in which you had a picture of the fen, and then you had a kind of caterpillar tractor moving back and forward across the camera with piles of smoking or steaming potatoes in the grab. And this was a fire in a potato warehouse. This was local news. And there are other stories. Often we will get little bits of snippets attached to big stories. So if something big happens in Iraq and somebody happens to have had a grandmother or a parent or been to school in a certain local area, you get the local story. And it always irritates me because the assumption is so obvious that on the one hand the BBC is presenting itself as a national, devolved, decentered organisation. And on the other hand, the formation and the format is such that it's completely impossible that anything other than trivia could ever happen or could ever start at the local level. So when I see those newscasts, and I realise, the region incidentally gets bigger and bigger every time the BBC does a cut. So now we're getting stories from halfway across England, and they're all presented as if they're basically about East Anglia. But the point I'm making is really that the regional and the local, when seen from the point of view of this sort of BBC structure, it reminds me of what Yeats once said about Scotland long ago. He said, "Scotland, thanks to the failure of its poets to imagine it more ambitiously, is nothing but a province with a sense of the picturesque." That there was nothing else there. And I think this is an issue that has been at the centre of the so-called Great British Art Debate project from the beginning. On the one hand, we have this problem of Britishness. When we started this project, I remember the meetings, we didn't have that title. We were going to call it Imagining a Nation. Well, and of course, we couldn't do that because there is no single nation. And then we thought, well, we're not doing things in Scotland, so we are actually in England, but we didn't want to call it Imagining England for various... It just went round and round like this. So you end up with this always slightly inadequate title, which is usually chosen because of its PR possibilities, which may, of course, not always be a correct judgment, but that's, I think, how we got to the Great British Art Debate. But the key thing for me is in those early discussions, we knew, on the one hand, that the British thing was going to be the biggest problem. There were two sides to Britishry, if I can put it this way. One is this centralised state, this whole history of a state associated with empire and colonisation, which nobody really in those meetings saw as unproblematic. Nobody particularly wanted to carry that forward. And the other is that definitions of Britishness stroke Englishness tend to just result in one set of cliches after another. You get the sort of, we all know the examples. We know George Orwell and the cycling maiden aunt going to communion. We know T.S. Eliot's list of beetroot juice and high cathedrals. I mean, there are all these lists of what national identity is within a British definition, and they always end up sort of expired and cliched and rather unhelpful. So that was the kind of, we had that awareness. Basically what the project was about was saying we've got some very interesting but also quite peculiar collections of artworks in this country, which were built up under often very particular, odd circumstances with great influence by particular philanthropists who happen to be very powerful in their places at particular times, often added to by committees that hedged their bets by buying 1.5 of everything but never more than 3 of anything, which makes it very difficult to exhibit a lot of this work. And we had those problems, and what we were trying to do in this scheme is to use these collections more effectively by teaming up as a group of 4 participatory galleries. There was, the regional so-called, the out-of-London galleries were watchful of the relationship with Tate, because obviously Tate has power and money and a much bigger collection. But basically, as an outsider sort of going along with this, it seemed to go quite well. And the shows, I think, have been very excellent. To my mind, the two things that they've done, apart from just indicating that there are indeed works that can be more interesting if given a bit of resource to distribute them and move them around the country. Certainly it's done that. I mean, a lot of these exhibitions are making works visible that have not been seen even in their own sort of local collection very much. But the other thing it's done is given interesting opportunities to create and to rethink the relationship between, say, educational programs in galleries and what goes on the walls, putting it crudely. And I think also to really work out how you can sort of set up conversations between historical art and contemporary art. I mean, one of the most obvious differences in this scheme happened when the landscape show, which started off out of London as a show that mixed contemporary and historical works, came to London and was reorganised in the Tate, and you got the contemporary much more at the end of the show. So if you saw both versions, it was really interesting to try and see how that choice really influenced the way one saw the whole body of the exhibition. My own preference was for the mixture because I thought it was unfair on Tracy Emin to assume that because she had done some things in watercolour, she was the final outcome of thousands of years of history. I mean, nobody intended that, but that was slightly what happens if you just trust chronology. But anyway, so that's just going back into the way these issues have been posed, the general issues, but I think also the really particular specific things that have been done under the scheme, which are about how we handle pictures, how we move around them, how we show them, and how we incorporate them into discussions. Obviously, the primary thing we were trying to deal with was the fact that the British population is not anything like it was when many of these collections were assembled. Anyway, we're going to try and come back to, and perhaps to try and sort of culminate this day, rather than to summarise all its conclusions or resolve all its differences. We've got about 35 minutes or thereabouts, and I've got 4 people with us, 2 of whom you have seen already today, 2 of whom you have not. One of them, David Anderson, sorry, here you are, David at the other end, from the National Museum of Wales, which I think it's true to say, David, you're a man of 3 or 4 different national experiences in your personal biography, which is interesting. Maybe we can come to that. We've got Reyahn King also, hello there, from National Museums Liverpool. And we've got Martin Myrone, who's been with the scheme a lot, all the way through, and who is, I've got you written down here as lead curator pre-1800 British art here at Tate, and also the John Martin show, which many of you will have seen. And finally, Iain Watson, who opened the session this morning from Tyne and Wear Archives and Museums. Can I just because we've not heard from you before, David, give us a little sense of your sense of what are the issues that you're bringing into this conversation?
I suppose that one of the issues that strikes me is that of who speaks and who is silent. And there's a book that I've found very influential by Miranda Fricker called Epistemic Injustice. And in that she says that the repeated experience of not being listened to very often leads to silencing. People stop using their voice in whatever way. And I'm also struck by something that Ben Ockery said actually in a television programme, not in writing as far as I'm aware, which was more or less accurately, I think, people deprived of their works of art. And he's describing here the Benin works that were effectively stolen by the British in the late 19th century. People deprived of their works of art are deprived of the repositories of their dreams. And I think you could also say people who are deprived of the opportunity to access to their works of art are deprived of the depositories of their dreams. I was very much also taken with some of the points that Peter Lord made about stressing the issues of inequality. Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland experience inequality in all sorts of ways. Of course, some regions of England, in fact every region of England in some way or another, experiences inequalities too. And those inequalities really matter. We haven't maybe talked enough about them today. And they do, however, provide an opening for discussion of Englishness as well as Scottish, Welsh and Irish identities. And Jez Butterworth's Jerusalem explores the dystopianism of that. There's also the silence of audiences. We've heard very little about audiences today. We've heard very little of their voice today as well. And that seems to me not to be an accident. I'm sorry that Mark Sands is not here, because my reaction to his description of the debate which he was offering was that that was insulting. That this was not a debate which would lead to a conclusion which would change things. That was almost, not just implicitly, almost explicitly described as not going to happen. That amounts to not being listened to. And if we're to look at the question of who is most silenced by the debate on Britishness, the answer is those people who matter most.
Reyahn.
Well, I'm coming from National Museums Liverpool, and on the one hand we are a national museum service, that's a recognition of the quality of our collections, and also we see ourselves at the Walker Art Gallery as being a sort of National Gallery of the North, but that would imply we're like the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square. We're actually sort of like the Trafalgar Square plus Tate Britain in one venue, plus a bit of V&A. But we also very much see ourselves as Liverpool's art gallery, and Liverpool, has described itself as centre of the creative universe. We already had the comment from Jeff about Liverpool's pride in itself as a city and seeing London as secondary. And I think what's been missing from today has been a recognition of how audiences view these issues. And it seems to me, certainly in Liverpool, what matters to our audiences is not questions of nation, but questions of Scouse-ness, actually. And our most popular exhibition during Capital of Culture Year in 2008, despite the fact that we had 60% of our visitors were tourists, our most popular exhibition was the Ben Jonson Liverpool Cityscape. And that was local people coming back again and again and again to talk to the artist about his view of Liverpool, and then to talk to him about their experience of Liverpool, and then finally coming back to look at the finished picture again. So I think that's an important thing to talk about, because I think hearing some of the really powerful conversations earlier today, particularly Peter's, I felt that actually some of those issues are also shared by people who have strong regional pride, but also by people who are ethnic minorities in this country. And Peter raised for me, I've worked in that area a bit, and Peter raised for me interesting issues around choosing or not to choose to be in the mainstream. And for many ethnic minority artists, actually the choice is not the one that Peter Lord was talking about, but actually the choice is to want to be seen as part of that larger mainstream. So I think that was very interesting and quite challenging.
While you were talking, I was remembering about, it must be 15 years ago, but Martin Parr, the photographer, made a film for BBC Two in which he travelled around mostly England. I think it probably was all England. He called it the frayed edges. He went to places like Blackpool. He went to lots of once maritime ports and towns that were suffering. And wherever he went, he asked people what it was to be English. What it was, what was Englishness to them? And nobody had anything to say about it. They all ummed and ahed, and it made one wonder, is this debate at the level of certainly of English national identity? I mean, is it the one that we should be having? I mean, but you're suggesting that people's interest is at a much more particular level, not just in Wales or Scotland, but in just about everywhere, perhaps.
Yes, I can't speak for Wales or Scotland, really, but I think, although, I was born in Edinburgh and I maintain a sort of, we all have multiple identities, so I would say I'm English, my accent would suggest I'm English, but I was born in Edinburgh, I go back there every year, I have a family there, so family connections there. So, I think the multiple identity things makes it complex. But I think in terms of what our audiences tell us, it's local particularity. And then perhaps the complexity of local particularity within identity issues that interest them, but not, Englishness. I think because it's so difficult to get a handle on, our audiences are not telling us that's what they want to hear. However, having said that, I also fear that sometimes curators hold back from dealing with issues of Englishness because of a sort of discomfort. So we're not comfortable with Englishness because somehow saying that you are English feels like a step on the path towards joining the English Defence League, at an extreme way of putting it. Or also saying you're English somehow links you to the British Empire if that's overly emphasised. And I think the problem with avoiding that is that you then don't reveal those deeper histories that actually have to be revealed in order to tell a kind of fair story or to tell multiple stories.
Iain, how does this sound from the point of view of Tyne and Wear? I mean, have you been using these shows you've been doing through the scheme we're talking about? Have you been using them to sort of find out more about your audiences?
We have, and I mean, I would very much echo what Reyan's been saying. I mean, I think it's very much a similar picture in the Northeast where people have a strong sense of association with the Northeast. The IPPR research I mentioned earlier, shows how even people who've relatively recently arrived often feel a sense of belonging to where they're living quite quickly. I mean, some research that we've done not around this project, but happening in parallel to this project, where we interviewed about 530 people working with Durham University Centre for Social Justice, showed that those people who were most recently arrived in the region felt most dissociated from the civil society and from their museums and galleries, and wanted to see more of their presence in there. But they wanted to belong and be part of that. So there was a sense of being part of that and in the region, not a sense of wanting to be English or British. They wanted a sense of that they're here right now. This is where they are. This is where I am. And I think for each of us, certainly for myself, there are few days on which I think of myself as being English or British, apart from when you have to fill in a form for a passport or whatever, or some questionnaire. There is, I think, an issue over the extent of challenge you have to your identity. And I suspect the more challenge you have to your national identity, the more you may need to express that. And we've had Philip Larkin quoted once today. If I can quote a different bit of Philip Larkin, there's a wonderful line, "Here, no elsewhere, underwrites my existence," which is not in terms of national identity, but it's in terms of a sense of belonging and a sense of place. So if we need to define ourselves by where we aren't, that's because our identity is being challenged. As you have a sense of comfort and association with your identity, there's less of a need for that defining by otherness as opposed to defining by sameness and actually where we are. And that's what we see certainly in the Northeast, a strong association. John Martin in particular has done that, and we've really developed that.
Yeah. I mean, John Martin was raised earlier on, and I was just going to briefly comment on it, coming from the perspective of the Tate end of things in the National Collection. Yes, we've got a big show here at Tate Britain, but it originated up in Newcastle, and John Martin, although we have that show, is not a canonical artist, right? He's much better represented in the collection in the Lane in Newcastle than he is in the Tate collection in London, and that's because historically people have been collecting him there and giving him to the Lane and representing him as an artist who has biographical roots in that area, though he wasn't necessarily that attached to it. And I think that as a way of forming a show has been very important, and something which has emerged out of the partnership, and which suggests that perhaps only around not the kind of the big issues that we're talking about today, but very pragmatic issues of where is the art and where is the Norwich School represented. It's represented much better in Norwich than it is in the National Collection. And so, when we think about a figure who we can view as significant in the history of British art, however we define that, it isn't only through the Tate collection. Far from it. Actually, you need to look far beyond and to make connections with communities and parties outside. And that's institutional, but it's also, as you've experienced when you had the show up there, very strongly felt at a kind of local level as well.
Absolutely.
Good. Well, we've got these four directors and curators here. I mean, and the brief I had for this session was to put your questions to them. So I think we're going to do that now, and we'll see how we get on. Questions are great, incidentally. It's us that might be in question as far as quality goes. But David, I've got one here which I thought you might be able to help us with. Art is subjective. There should not be a scale of greatness, but unfortunately society dictates that there is. And I wondered, is greatness as dictated by society or by social convention a problem for you working in the National Gallery of Wales?
I think this has been discussed a little bit already today. I mean, the issue of greatness, I think, was looked at. I have a difficulty if it is seen as being another way of saying a defined excellence. And I think one comes back to context, really. I mean, I really strongly responded to what Jeff was saying about geographical location being significant. and that locating works and actually locating museums as well in the communities and societies of which they're part and contemporary societies, is critically important. So I suppose I do shy away from it because of the implication of a canon, which we did talk about before.
But are there other ways I mean, are you relaxed about measuring artistic activity or projects or works in according to different criteria?
Well, we all use criteria. I think the reason I was reacting against the term was that there is an implication of permanence to it as well. And that provided things are always open to questioning and challenging. In fact, actually, as Peter was questioning and challenging the National Museum of Wales, even today, really, I think that's a healthy process. I mean, there are ways of looking at greatness in terms of the products of works of art, but there's actually also, if you take out the word great, but in valuable perhaps, value in the ways in which audiences are engaged as well. And I find it very hard to separate audience experience and sources, if you like, and they'd interact with each other all the time. So I think actually maybe the combination of those things can have high value, if that's the word you want to use for it.
Sorry. Yeah, Martin.
So, but one way that I might interpret that, and I think you're making very important points there, is that it raises the question of value judgments and the way that the value judgments that we make, or which are implicit in the decisions that we make about what exhibitions we choose to put on, what we decide to put on the walls, what we decide to acquire, can contain within them judgments about the regional versus the national, and I mean, the question of whether an artist belongs in the national collection, whether at Liverpool or in London or in Edinburgh, or whether they only belong in a regional collection, is something which is clearly being part of the mix for how we work as curators and within museums. And as I say, with John Martin or with the Bristol School of Artists, or with artists who are actually represented not only in the national collection but around and the country, and it's we are in a position now where technology is making those collections much more readily available and perhaps much more readily kind of accessible as well, and so we can shift our understanding of where is British art to be rather more diffuse than it has been in the past.
Reyahn, as somebody who's not been involved in the previous sessions, I can safely put this to you. This debate feels utterly remote from real concerns and language of ordinary people who may or may not be visiting museums now. Are you going to defend museums and their right to have a debate that may seem arcane and irrelevant, or do you think it's a general problem that we have to face up to?
Well, I think that sometimes debates that are challenging are the ones that actually are the meaningful ones. And sometimes I find myself with art as well. You look at a work of art, and I find if I'm particularly challenged by it, and almost sometimes if I think I'm really not sure about it, I remind myself that those are sometimes the very artists that I go back to and learn from, and realise that actually I'm challenged because I need to think about it. And great art has got great ideas in it. So I think we should have those debates. And I think actually some things that were said today were quite challenging, certainly for me. And, I was saying to Peter that I was a bit embarrassed, really, that we have quite a high Welsh audience in Liverpool, but we haven't probably thought about the issues that he was putting today as profoundly as he has done. And I've asked him to come to Liverpool and talk to us more about those. I think we should do that, but I think we have to be careful about how we communicate our debates, and that we have to be responsible to make sure that what we talk about is interesting, and we talk about it in an interesting way and in an accessible way.
So when you think about your audience, you're not actually thinking about them in terms of public relations only. You're not just thinking of people to swing over to your position.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think actually what we want to do is we want to get people to think and to debate themselves. I think what our view is in some ways less interesting than actually stimulating the debate and making people think about things in different ways.
Good. Iain, why don't you try one of these? Why are there so few women on the panels?
I was wondering.
I'm going to go. I used to play a bit of rugby. I was going to kind of...
It is noticeable
Martin can answer that very well.
You can pass that to me. I mean, one thing to say is that I mean, there's meant to be a woman sitting here, and it's just a diary clash. I mean, it was impossible. So, you know, I'm quite well versed in queer theory, but I don't think I'm going to be able to go so far as to claim I am actually a woman on this panel. There is a kind of sheer pragmatics that when you're organising a panel, as it happened, I ran a conference here the other day which had an all-female lineup, funnily enough, and it didn't even occur to me until afterwards that it was that was the case. So it is just how the dice have fallen. And we did face this question. Is this diverse enough? We weren't interested, actually I'll personalise and say I wasn't interested in doing a kind of quota to represent diversity on these panels, other than what was the real motivator behind thinking, well, who do we want to speak today, and who's going to contribute, and who is really going to open up the debate, and who perhaps hasn't been that well represented in the Great British Art Debate in previous sessions, and in the seminars that we've run, and other conferences and events. And that really has been, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and thinking also about some of the more challenging or kind of big issues about the regions as well. So when it is how the dice has fallen, but the questions of kind of gender representation on the panels was not what we were looking for. And I'll put my hands up and fess up. And we looked at it and thought, oh, crikey, this is who we've ended up with. So
there are lots of women in the galleries that were involved.
Well, there's lots in this room as well. Actually,
it
was quite striking as people filed in today. We're looking around, oh, look, it's quite a divide there. But
Reyahn, you want to say something?
Yes, I'd actually like to ask all the partners about a linked question, which is, we had last night at Tate, as I understand it, a talk by Paul Goodwin about the thin black line display, yet Paul isn't here. And those issues about diversity within Britishness, we've talked very much about Englishness and Britishness. We haven't talked about the quite complex relationship that many people, like myself, I talked about multiple identities. I relate to Scotland, I relate to England, I'm Muslim. Many people have complex identities, and I feel that hasn't been part of this discussion, and that the people who are in this organisation working around some of those areas maybe, I'd like to know if they've been involved in earlier stages in the debate.
When we started this process, and it has been through quite a journey, this was one of the big issues that we had, and we obviously had some input from Paul Gilroy in the very early stage. We had input from Nima Purveyor-Smith, who helped us shape it. There is a reality that certainly for some of the partners, they work in areas which have a very small percentage of people from BME backgrounds, but they're not culturally diverse, because they are culturally diverse. We've done possibly less specific work on those issues, but we have offered the opportunity for people to explore those themes. We, at one point in the project, we'd actually sort of mapped out, rather than having the exhibitions that we ended up with, picking up particular things such as immigration, empire. We felt that didn't work. That was imposing too much of a structure on the collection that we had. Wasn't going to drive in that, but there may well be comments, particularly from people in the audience who've been working in terms of the learning programs, the engagement programs. So it'd be great actually to ask people there to feedback, because it's a good question.
I really understand the thing about, I've moved from working in Birmingham, very diverse city, to working in Liverpool, which, although it has very old diverse communities, they're quite small comparatively. So I understand that, we as gallery directors tend to be a bit driven by audience numbers, and I understand how that equation comes in. But I think actually that then the challenge is, so how do you do a show that tells people about our shared history? Because actually the history of Black and Asian artists in this country is as much everybody's history in this room and everybody's history in Newcastle as it is the Black and Asian people's history. So, I suppose that's my other challenge around that area.
And isn't it the case that in some of these shows, and perhaps particularly the ones you call tasters, this is exactly what people were doing? And these are the questions that some of the educational initiatives were actually directly engaging. So there is more experience over the last 3 years than might appear visible right now.
And I think the situation is changing, because in a way, some contemporary artists would say it's not an issue because we've got Chris O'Feely, we've got Steve McQueen. And they would say we don't want to be put into that category. But from my perspective as a curator who specialised more in the historical, there are still stories to be told about earlier generations. that are still not being told as much as they might be.
Okay. I've got another question here which is slightly different. It's about Britishness. The question, it's only half a question, but I'll give it to you. Can an Italian marble carved in London by a Swede be British? And it's an interesting question in itself, but I think it raises that other difference we've had going all day, which is about Britishness as a centralised, state-based, historically formed set of identities, and Britain as a piece of land, as a piece of rock, if you like, with people upon it. And I wondered whether, David, you think about both, because we've had various arguments that, if we think of art in Britain, we get one set of arguments, and if we think of British art, we get another set of problems. And in fact, people who've been trying to loosen the definition of Britishness have at the same time also insisted that we face the Britishness thing. We don't just move into geography.
Yeah, I think there's a distinction between Britishness in terms of an historical context, where it was applied, if you like, within a genuine political framework, and Britishness, we have it today in a cultural context where culture has devolved legally, constitutionally. And I think it's completely appropriate to explore issues of Britishness in an historical context. I think it's inappropriate to use the term about how we operate within the cultural sector now. It should not be used, I would say, without consent. That consent, I would argue, is almost impossible to get.
Anywhere now.
In the context of the cultural sector. Ed Vaizey's statement that he believed himself to be the Minister of Culture for the United Kingdom revealed a profound ignorance of his own role, let alone that of Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, but it is indicative. And likewise, the Tate Gallery is not actually funded by the UK government, it's funded by DCMS. And we, the National Museum of Wales, are funded by the Welsh Government. The landscape has changed profoundly, but the behaviour of most UK-wide organisations has not changed, and that needs to be rethought. So I have very different feelings about the piece of sculpture than I do about the use of the term Britishness in this context for this project, which I feel is illegitimate.
Can I, because I was pressed on this as a question earlier on, can I ask about your collecting remits as the National Museum of Wales, as National Museums Liverpool? How was your collecting remit defined, and how does national figure in defining that remit?
Yeah, I think we have a responsibility to collect beyond Wales, and that goes beyond any definition of Britishness. We also have what is in fact a prior responsibility to collect within Wales as well in ways that represent Wales. And I think one of the things that came through very strongly from the 1927 Museum Council was that we were not to be like the British Museum in Wales. We, in other words, had to reflect the fact that we were in a separate country, and therefore the needs of that country, which included, as has been said, a sense of relationship with the international, was really important for that. And we do operate hugely internationally.
My answer is almost exactly the same, actually, in that we're national, but our collection history has been to collect nationally and internationally and locally. So, and we continue to do all of those things. I think what perhaps drives our collecting policy that isn't historic is a sensitivity to audience. And I'm very proud of the fact that the Walker Art Gallery's history has been always to match buying works that art historians consider great, and buying works very deliberately, like our most famous painting, And When Did You Last See Your Father by Yeames, which was bought in the 19th century because the committee thought that it would be popular and it would be a nice, accessible painting for an introduction to art. So for us, our collecting policy is partly about continuing to have a really strong, internationally important collection, but it's also about that engagement with our audiences.
Was there some sense that Liverpool needed a painting that would be a good introduction to art in the 19th century, more than Trafalgar Square?
You'd have to ask Trafalgar Square what their view was, I think.
David, can I ask you a question about pine trees? Do you mind? It's
Probably,
it's,
yes.
it's also about rootedness, and I'm asking because I noticed I recently read a poem by R.S. Thomas, the Welsh poet, who was talking about Forestry Commission plantations in Wales, and I think he must have been writing it more or less at the same time as reservoirs were being built to sort of drown villages to create water supplies for Manchester and places. And there's very strong Welsh horror at these sort of assumptions that it was legitimate to do this. And his argument about these plantations of pine trees is that they were sort of British imperialists. Every tree was like a sort of invading force. Now, if you go to Scotland, the pine tree is also seen that way. These Forestry Commission sort of Sitka spruce plantations, which are, well, they're probably being pulled down now or harvested, but all over the Highlands were seen again as sort of the visual presentation of what the British state does in Scotland. In England, when people started objecting about pine trees being planted by the Forestry Commission, they called them all German. They said these trees are they're German. I mean, in fact, they're all the Sitka spruce and the Douglas fir. They're all from North America, I believe, or maybe they're from Scandinavia. But the argument was very strongly that they were aliens too. But they didn't know who to identify them with, so they pointed at the accusing finger at Germany because German foresters had apparently been involved. Well, the reason I'm asking this is because it seemed to me very interesting that if you're in if you're in Wales or in Scotland and you want to talk about destruction and the sort of encroachment on tradition, you're in one position. Whereas if you're in England, you're sort of trapped with a sort of fear of you're searching around for some cause to attach your argument to. Do you know what I mean? That there is. You were mentioning earlier how people in England feel that they're always edged with British National Party type politics, so they start talking about roots. And I wondered, is this sort of the idea of seeing your nation as a kind of organic identity that is faced with systematic encroaching attack or dilution or whatever, or contamination. Is that something that is being changed dramatically in Wales now as a result of these movements, these devolutionary movements?
I should say I've only lived in Wales for a year. I mean, I was born in Northern Ireland, grew up in the industrial Midlands, studied Irish history in Edinburgh University in Scotland, worked as a teacher and a museum person in southern England, in London, and now I'm living in Wales for 1 year. It happens my grandfather at one point on my mother's side was a forester in Northern Ireland and was working on exactly such a forest as you were describing. I don't remember what he called it, but here we are. I think Amin Maalouf in his book on identity described us all as being, like tapestries with multicoloured threads. And he said that the vertical threads are the ones that we inherit through birth and locality of birth, if you like, really, which in my case obviously is Belfast and Northern Ireland. But then the horizontal threads are those things which are our life experiences. And none of us, or at least it's rare these days perhaps, maybe that's not true, maybe that's something to do with social class as well. It's rare for those of us who are middle class perhaps now to be single-threaded, if you like, really. And we've heard that already from others on the panel. So I suppose the question of rootedness I found very difficult to separate from these complex issues of identity. But I suppose that I also think that there is an inequality of opportunity for diversity of rootedness and diversity of experience. And again, I come back to inequality in all this, really, because I think there are experiences of inequality which need to be taken on board whenever we discuss these issues. And I think with occasional, maybe more than occasional, but sometimes today we've talked about those inequalities in various forms. But they are there all the time in this discussion, and I think we have to combine discussion of inequality with any discussion of rootedness. And they don't necessarily mean England, with Scotland, Wales and Ireland, although I have to say the experience of being in Wales for the last year has brought home to me very forcibly, in a way I'd never had before, the inequality of relationships at a sectoral level, if you like, really, between England and the other three countries. But that's maybe
can you explain
issue.
what you mean by that?
Oh, right, okay. Well, let's take the Catalyst funding, for example. Funded by DCMS and Arts Council and HLF. English institutions can apply for all of that funding. The only bit that's accessible to Welsh institutions is the HLF element of it. The constraints of how you can apply for that, for the HLF bit, make it virtually impossible for Welsh institutions, and I suspect North of England institutions and many other institutions, to get any access to that. I asked if anybody had spoken to the Welsh government before that was launched, and the answer from somebody from Arts Council England was no.
Okay, Iain, did you?
Well, I was just going to come in and say, I think, really agree with what David was saying there about the inequality side. And I also think what's really interesting is who defines people's identity. And people, you have to have an element, you define your identity yourself, which is really important. And there's a real danger in some of these areas of, it's the kind of false memory syndrome, false identity creation. I mean, just watching something on TV earlier this week with summer solstice celebrations at Avebury, where the presenter glibly said, and these celebrations have continued unbroken for 3,000 years. I don't believe it.
No, right, fair enough. But there's another question that's in my mind as we're talking, is that we have much of the material we've been talking about, you could sort of see in terms of a distinction between two different impulses. One of them being about mobility and movement and connectedness to wider currents, exploitative or dreadful as they may well be. And the other is about settlement, about being immobile. And it seems that we live in a culture which is increasingly encouraging everyone to value mobility, to value. I mean, this is what intellectual theory really gets off on mobility. I mean, this story, the Amin Malouf book. I mean, he's a Lebanese French Christian, isn't he? I mean, that's a very interesting book, but it's also a classic book of that tendency that what's interesting to him is the life that has moved between things, and we are then left with a collection of questions around what about the people whose situation doesn't move. And we are, I think, with this current economic situation, going to see more and more of that. The world's going to be full of people who are just dumped out into their locality with no work, no activity, let's hope not, but that's the route we're on.
That's part of the point I was trying to make about inequality, really.
Yeah.
And I think, actually, that's going to be the case for art, particularly. Philip Dodd was talking at the very beginning today about the importance of the concept of British art internationally. And, I think he's right. I think that's true. I think we can, galleries can work with those big names like Gary Hume. But tomorrow's great artists are today's local and regional artists. And I think there's a real danger that the concentration on London at a time of reduction in funding, particularly reduction in funding to artist-led organisations, will mean that we do end up with a sort of, making the next generation of artists not secure. We can't assume that a current kind of, actually now 20-year-old group of British artists are going to be enough to keep the great British art, or whatever, however we define great, to keep the quality of British art and our reputation going, unless we actually are willing to invest beyond London.
Very good. I'm glad you mentioned Philip Dodd, because he was talking about how we've been having these conferences for 25 years. Well, I've certainly been going to them for 25 years. And for 25 years, I've heard Philip Dodd stand up and say, look around the room and say, the wrong people are here. I swear, he's been doing it for 25 years. And I know the point he's making, but I also get slightly irritated by it. Anyway, here's another question. How far do you think we have sacrificed artistic talent for the shock factor in modern British art, i.e. the YBAs? Martin, it has to be for you.
Well, I don't know how that works.
Well, you haven't spoken recently.
Other than, I suppose we could refer to John Martin again, actually. And John Martin has been a fantastic project to work on because of what it tells us about where British art is, but also because that question of value judgments and canon very much come into play with saying, well, if you're going to, actually put all that energy and time and thought into presenting this, this figure as a major British artist, whatever that means in this context, it tends to be done on the basis that because we think he's a really great artist, right? And what's interesting about John Martin is that he kind of isn't by most standards. He's a fascinating and fabulous artist, and if you like that kind of thing, as I do, fortunately, and as many of my colleagues in the project do, then he is well worth holding up as not as an exemplar in the way that people would tend to hold up Turner as an inspiration and as the kind of epitome of what you can be as a painter. And John Martin is an artist who manipulated or tried to manipulate his audiences, and who used shock and spectacle in order to engage and to kind of drive the reception of his own work. So I guess, I would come at it as somebody who's kind of trained in 18th and 19th century art, rather than trying to deal with the YBAs, it also suggests that there's a historical perspective. And I think that there is that underlying question of when we put art in a museum, if it is only about shock and spectacle, then is that necessarily a bad thing? I mean, you can... that can be an interesting and valuable experience, aside from wanting to set up some standard of what art should be, and seeing shock and spectacle and things as things which should be excluded from that exemplar.
I think also, I think time will judge there. If we look at John Martin, it's slightly glib, but in the process we sort of, we tied the John Martin influence right the way through to Will Smith and The Last Man. So, and Steven Spielberg. So, he's still there and relevant. Will the YBAs be relevant in 150 years? We'll have to see.
Reyahn, you're another sort of historical specialist, if I can put it that way. But and what about shock factor to you? Are you at ease with it, or do you think it's a form of fraud?
Neither of those, really. I'm at ease with it in the sense that I think, however we're defining it, art in Britain is essentially following a European notion of art, which is a notion of art that's been, since the Renaissance, tied to an idea of the avant-garde and tied to an idea that art has to be on a sort of trajectory of change. And I say that quite carefully because, we have to be very aware that actually we've been talking today about a globalised art world, but actually all over the rest of the world, including large parts of the Muslim world, the definition of great art is not around a trajectory of change and the avant-garde. So that's a sort of caveat. Having said all of that, almost everything that's in the Walker Art Gallery is part of that tradition. And our best kind of example of shock and how it diminishes is we have a display of many of the prize winners since 1957 of the John Moores Painting Prize. And near each of those paintings, we have quotes from the newspapers of the time, including the local papers, and it's always, this is outrageous. And then, it goes right through, and it's interesting to look now at the paintings that were thought of as outrageous. Like there's a David Hockney that people thought shouldn't have won the prize, and Peter Doig, and so you can see how actually it doesn't take very long for the shock to wear off.
David? No?
I think it's been covered.
You're probably right. Let's have... Things have to change in order that everything should stay the same. Well, if we live in a post-Western world, will everything really stay the same? Isn't that notion of control itself outdated? I don't know, maybe that's three questions, but it's all in the same hand. But things have to change in order that everything should stay the same. Is that something you can think through usefully or interestingly?
I'm not sure I can think through the first part, but the second part of the point of the question which is raised there.
A post-Western world.
Yeah, I've picked up on this as a motif which has recurred through the day in various different contexts, in various different ways of on the one hand, a move towards globalisation, which may be experienced at a perfectly individual level, right? That you are Irish and Scottish and French at the same time, and you live in Australia or whatever it might mean. Those combinations that we've heard in a number of contexts, and in terms of a global art market and a kind of a global circulation of artworks and ideas. On the other hand, we've also heard about regionalism and about rootedness and about a sense of how people may engage at a regional level and feel tremendous pride and engagement. And I'm running through this, but I don't actually know what to make of this, because what's missing out is the terms that we've actually tried to put into play today, which are nation and British and Britishness. It seems like people's experiences are telling them that nation and Britishness is actually a gap, and we're working around that gap by referring to the global and we're referring to the regional.
I suppose one of my reasons for discomfort with the definitions of Britishness and terms like that is that we talk so little about universal rights. And there were attempts to define Englishness as part of the discussion earlier on today as well, sometimes in terms of sport, love, or Britishness rather, in sport, love, and so on. There are such things as cultural rights that every individual across the world is supposed to have. And my concern is that very often these are defined in terms of the rights of an individual artist to express themselves, like Ai Weiwei. another Tate discussion, if you like, really, this one. I apologise for that. And I'm not saying that those are not important, but what I am saying is there are other ways of defining cultural rights as well, partly in terms, again, it's probably fairly familiar of the rights of indigenous groups to the totality of their culture, but also, perhaps more close to home here, the rights of individual citizens to participate in a meaningful way in culture. And unless we're prepared to accept some of those cultural rights as being a foundation for any discussion of Englishness, Britishness, Scottishness, Irishness, Welshness, or whatever it is, then I think that attempts to sort of find essential characteristics of Britishness are thinly rooted, if I could use your term.
And bound to become inadequate
Exactly,
cliches.
yeah.
I think that's true, I agree. Isn't that notion of control itself outdated? I think I wouldn't want to answer that if I was asked it, because it's not quite clear what to take from it. But isn't Tate, this again is another one that is connected to our sense of Tate, isn't Tate presenting virtually the same picture of British art as is being presented by the private galleries at art fairs, etc., only for the benefit of foreign visitors to London? Well, that's interesting, in the sense that I can remember some years ago I did some work for the Hayward Gallery, which was trying to work out where it should go. And I do remember we had to sort of review what all the London galleries were offering. It was only about London because it was the Hayward. And we realised that when the Hayward was in its pride, I guess, in the 60s and 70s and even a bit later, it was very clearly the gallery of contemporary art in London. There maybe was one other. But we then realised when you look around at the end of the 90s or the early 2000s, as it was, that almost every gallery in London was competing for the same material. I mean, you'd find it at the Royal Academy, you'd find it at Tate, you'd find it at Tate Britain, and so there is this sense in which a kind of great expansion of art provision apparently has taken place across the public and the private areas. And it's reasonable to ask, is it just basically all the same? I mean, are they all presenting the same? What's left that's specific? That's, I think, what the question is about. Aren't you presenting virtually the same picture of British art as being presented by the private galleries and art fairs? What do you think?
Well,
I mean,
shall I jump in, because I'm not part of Tate, clearly. What about the whole historical perspective in which it sits? I walked through the gallery to go to the Barry Flanagan, admittedly this afternoon, but I'm not going to talk about Barry Flanagan. But there were a group of, I don't know whether it was a school group or Cubs, Scouts, whatever, just a group of kids sketching in the galleries, lying over the floor, sat on the seat sketching, really doing it. Isn't that great? Isn't that what it's about? I thought, so that it was happening, it was doing it, and it was working in that, in a gallery with a mix of different works in, but from quite a span of historical periods. And that is that advantage, is that collection that you can work with that, you can pick what you want to do. If we think there's any value in engaging with historical art, then I think it's there being delivered.
So when you answer that, do you in your own mind also answer Philip Dodd's question, which was, I mean, being a bit ruder than he was, only a bit, he implied that, all these public galleries were just sort of slightly mediocre and a bit asleep, and that the life was in the private world. I mean, you heard it, that's more or less what he said, wasn't it? But you're suggesting there is something really particular to the public galleries that is not generalisable across into the private world anyway.
Well, to me, what I heard him talk about, and it may have been my take on it, was that the contemporary art market and very much more contemporary dealing in modern and contemporary art, as opposed to a collection-based approach to tradition, bringing up that really crucial dialogue between the contemporary and the historic. And I just believe that is so important, because I find that in some cases the historic is the route people choose to come to the contemporary. For other people, the contemporary is the route to the historic. There's a wonderful phrase that I came across recently, and I've forgotten who said it, unfortunately, but ignoring history is like trying to plant cut flowers. And I think that's it.
I suppose I'd pick up and refer back to something that Craig was raising earlier on, is that it's fairly evident that global capitalism is being reconfigured, whether dramatically or less dramatically. So if there is, or if we can detect allegiances between a global and commercially driven art market and certainly in the contemporary field, public art institutions, then it is likely that relationship is going to be reconfigured in the future as well. And it may be that those old ideals of
of public institutions and publicly funded institutions somehow standing aside from commercial force and standing for something else may come back into play. That's maybe unusually idealistic, I think, but it's...
I suppose the thing that worries me is that we have not perhaps articulated effectively what public good and public value could be. And that one of the reasons why Philip Dodd and others can throw at us that we should almost join in or step aside, really, become the Bates Hotel, is that we've shied away from some of the most important elements of public value, really, partly because they challenge some of the other tenets that we may hold. And those include the issue of the position of the artist in relation to collections and the position of the audience in relation to collections, and they don't always coincide. So these are not always easy to answer, but nevertheless I think that there are ways of articulating and formulating what we do, which I think some people hinted at when they were talking about the value of the BBC, for example, is that there are some things that the BBC at its best represents that could not be replicated in the private sector.
Yeah, good.
And I worry about the general diversity of what is on offer. And I went to Malaga, and this is taking it beyond the UK, but I went to Malaga recently and excitedly went to a contemporary art venue, and I found an exhibition by Mark Quinn. And I was a bit disappointed because I wanted to see what was going on in Spain, And I actually think that the danger of Philip Dodd's approach, while, I almost feel like I want to do everything, do all of it, because if you only do the art market stuff, then you're missing out a whole group of artists who are actually probably better positioned to engage with our audiences. There are artists out there whose work actually is around engaging with people. And, in terms of public value, those are the artists that we should be engaging with and supporting locally and regionally, because they are, bringing that kind of joy in art directly into what they do. But also I worry that, things would become very boring if we all just start showing the same stuff. And the way not to do that is to have some respect for curators' ability to look beyond the current canon. And I do worry that our art institutions actually do not have faith or willing to take the risk in letting regional curators decide on acquisitions that are not part of the current canon, actually, and that is a concern.
So you mean the regional becomes the place where...
We're told by London what we ought to want to buy
Yeah.
for our collections on occasion.
Right, and sometimes offered money to do it.
Indeed, yes, and not often money to do things
To
that
do
we
other
think
things,
are
yeah.
important
Sure,
regionally. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Okay, Iain, maybe this one's for you. The conversations have been leading us, particularly the public art galleries, towards the idea of being increasingly focused on the regional and regional identities of our audience. Is there a point at which we might become too introspective and irrelevant? How could this be avoided? In other words, can one go into the regional in a way that ends up being a kind of dead end, I guess is what that question is.
There was that wonderful headline, wasn't there, once upon a time, Fogging Channel, continent cut off. And, we don't want to go there again. So, yes, absolutely, there is always a risk. And, I think that given the way we're anchored in our collections, that those collections are not just regional, they are national and international elements to them as well, certainly for the other partners in this project. We'll continue to do things that relate to that. I think because our audiences are not static. Again, I've said that in the Northeast we have a very low percentage of BME populations, but we have the fastest rate of increase of BME populations in the country. Our population is changing incredibly rapidly from a very low point. So that focusing on the change in our population, and whilst also picking up some of the issues about the economic crisis and the mobility of, in particular, the traditional working class population, which is a real issue that does concern me. Equally, our population is dynamic, it is changing, and I think it's up to us to not be parochial. It's up to us to do projects like this, frankly, because that dialogue that's happened for us in the Northeast with Norwich, with Sheffield, with Tate Britain here in London. Through that dialogue, we've made some connections. Some of the things that we've done, work with some of our audiences and encourage people to move around between the venues and the galleries, see what's common, what's different, what's the experience of migration in Newcastle compared to the experience of migration in Norwich, and how does that help you move on? And if you're having those sort of dialogues, it avoids you, I think, getting locked into that navel gazing.
I think the other thing to say about the Philip Dodd issue around the market is that the market sorts itself out. So there's all the more reason for us who are publicly funded to actually be interested in investigating and bringing to the public eye those very artists who the market will not bring to the public eye.
Okay, your image about fog, incidentally, reminded me, I was in Dublin once, I got on a bus, and I was sitting there and a lady got on, she'd been shopping, and she had a big plastic bag, and it had the name of this shop, I guess it was a department store of some sort, and the slogan was almost nationwide. I thought that was great. It was so good. It was like they obviously didn't quite have a shop in Cork yet or something, but it was like that idea that the local is a perspective of its own. Yeah. And I think what you're saying is simply that these really important themes, which are by no means local in their significance, can only really be engaged in some sort of situated way. So, this is the question, is how material comes back from the so-called regional in that sense and gets thought about in broader or more networked ways. Isn't Britishness simply a question that should only be answered privately?
It's a bit late for that, really, isn't it?
Well, yeah, at the end of the day, or not at all, yeah, okay, we can't have that one. Why were there no women speakers on the conference? We've had that already. It's well worth returning to, but I'm not going to late. Yeah, a good point. Should the Take Britain campaign be inverted? Is this Britain rather than or the authoritarian, this is Britain? I think we've talked about this. Or are the artworks authoritative enough in themselves? Are people needing authoritative assertions of what Britishness is? And can one gallery provide this? I think it's fair to generalise and say that the answer to all those questions is probably no, and we all agree. So thank you. I'm going to say we've got to 25 past. I was told we could go until 1:30, but are there any points that people would like to raise? I mean, people who never got round to writing the thing in the orgone box at the front? No, okay. Well, in which case, I'm going to say thank you very much for coming. And what an interesting set of discussions. And I do hope that we can get round some of the sort of difficulties of, sort of forcing people to speak in caricatures. Not that we've done that, but I think that is one of the big questions here, that if you have this situation when you pose a centre, which is London, basically, and even in attempts to sort of get away from it, which is what this whole project has been about, or away from that sort of monolithic quality in it, you still find yourself inviting people to conferences to speak about what it's like not to be in the centre. And I think we should apologise to people who felt excessively constrained by that brief, because it wasn't part of anyone's intention. But anyway, thank you very much for being here, and I hope you found things useful. And thank you especially, too, for my panellists.
Thanks very much.
And, yeah, I failed to say that Iain has a few closing words.
Yes, so I'll be very, very brief because it has been a long day, and thank you for staying with it. Thanks very much indeed to Patrick for chairing this, to all our speakers and panellists. We really appreciate people giving up their time. Obviously, I'd like to thank all the partners for their contribution. We wouldn't have had a project without all the 4 partners in that. In terms of today, thanks to Take Britain for hosting. Particular thanks to Marie Mortensen and Martin Myrone, who've done a lot of work with the conference team in actually making today happen. Thanks to Helen Griffiths and Gracie Duval, who've been running around with microphones and also done a lot of the organisation for today. Thank you to the Heritage Lottery Fund for funding it, and thanks to our webcasters as well for making sure that this wasn't just a debate that happened here, but this was a debate that happened not only all over Britain, but all over the world. Thank you.